Here's a live look at the White House where President Biden is speaking.
You face moments when you need the courage to exercise the full power of the presidency. You also face moments where you need the wisdom to respect the limits of the power of the office of the presidency. This nation was founded on the principle that there are no kings in America. Each of us is equal before the law. No one is above the law, not even the President of the United States. With today's Supreme Court decision on presidential immunity, that fundamentally changed. For all practical purposes, today's decision almost certainly means that there are virtually no limits on what a president can do. This is a fundamentally new principle, and it's a dangerous precedent, because the power of the office will no longer be constrained by the law, even including the Supreme Court of the United States. The only limits will be self-imposed by the president alone. This decision today has continued the court's attack in recent years on a wide range of long-established legal principles in our nation, from gutting voting rights and civil rights, to taking away a woman's right to choose, to today's decision that undermines the rule of law of this nation. Nearly 4 years ago, my predecessor sent a violent mob to the U.S. Capitol to stop the peaceful transfer of power. We all saw it with our own eyes. We sat there and watched it happen that day. Attack on the police, the ransacking at the Capitol, a mob literally hunting down the House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, gallows erected to hang the Vice President, Mike Pence. I think it's fair to say it's one of the darkest days in the history of America. Now the man who sent that mob to the U.S. Capitol is facing potential criminal conviction for what happened that day. And the American people deserve to have an answer in the courts before the upcoming election. The public has a right to know the answer about what happened on January 6th before they are asked to vote again this year. Now, because of today's decision, that is highly, highly unlikely. It's a terrible disservice to the people of this nation. So now the American people have to do what the courts should have been willing to do, but will not. The American people have to render a judgment about Donald Trump's behavior. The American people must decide whether Donald Trump's assault on our democracy on January 6th makes him unfit for public office in the highest office in the land. The American people must decide if Trump's embrace of violence to preserve his power is acceptable. Perhaps most importantly, the American people must decide if they want to entrust the president once again, the presidency, to Donald Trump, now knowing he'll be even more emboldened to do whatever he pleases whenever he wants to do it. You know, at the outset of our nation, it was the character of George Washington, our first president, that defined the presidency. He believed power was limited, not absolute, and that power always resides with the people, always. Now, over 200 years later, with today's Supreme Court decision, once again, it will depend on the character of the men and women who hold that presidency that are going to define the limits of the power of the presidency, because the law will no longer do it. I know I will respect the limits of the presidential powers I have for 3.5 years, but any president, including Donald Trump, will now be free to ignore the law. I concur with Justice Sotomayor's dissent today. Here's what she said. She said, in every use of official power, the president is now a king above the law. With fear for our democracy, I dissent. End of quote. So should the American people dissent. I dissent. May God bless you all, and may God help preserve our democracy. Thank you. And may God protect our troops.
Let's now bring in CBS News senior White House correspondent Weijia Jiang as we watch the president after his remarks. Weijia, the first public remarks for the president since that debate, and it pretty much starkly outlined what he says this election, that debate was all about, what this election is all about.
That's right, John. The campaign really hopes that today's ruling is a turning point for them because they want to turn the page on that debate that you just mentioned and focus on the very contrast that they've been trying to draw now for several months between President Biden and former President Trump. So you heard from Biden just there, really echoing what we've been hearing from campaign aides and from White House sources all day long, that this is a clear choice, they say, between somebody that they acknowledge, they say had just a bad night during a debate, versus a, quote, wannabe autocrat. And you heard there from President Biden painting again the picture of January 6th and what happened there with a stark warning that now he says Trump is emboldened to do whatever he wants. And the campaign pointed out earlier that this is what Trump wants and has admitted that he wants to seek political retribution and revenge. And they are saying that this decision today will allow him to do that. And so they're really hoping that this message resonates with voters. But, John, even though they're saying there's nothing to see anymore with regard to the president's performance, of course, there are still many questions about what happened to him that night and why he was not able to verbalize all the things that he just did in these remarks to the American public. And I do think it's notable, John, that he had a teleprompter tonight and he made the decision not to take any questions from the reporters who were also in the room. The day after the debate, he also had a teleprompter when he was clearly more energetic and sharper than he was on stage during the debate. So even though, you could argue that this was a very different Biden from what we saw on the debate stage, I think, segment of the American public want to know where was he when it really mattered, when he was face to face with the person that he just warned against tonight. John?
And Weijia, is the White House saying anything about the second opportunity to take that case to Donald Trump in the next debate that they have scheduled for September to engage in what will be an even more closely watched debate than the first one, probably, in which the president would have a chance to make that case directly with the other man standing right there on the debate stage with him to keep this choice as sharp as the campaign would like to keep it? Have they been saying anything about that second debate?
Well, John, they have said that there are no changes, and the campaign has told CBS News that the president is committed to that second debate with Donald Trump in September. But there's a lot of time, John, between now and then. We don't know what the rules would be. We don't know if there are other incidents that might occur in which the president has similar episodes to what we saw on the debate stage, because while you're right in that it could be another opportunity to show the American public that what they saw on Thursday night was not representative of how he served in the Oval Office, it is also an extremely vulnerable position for the president, because what if he had another performance like he did the other night? Would he be able to recover from that? And I have talked to Democratic sources who worry about that very thing because, as one person put it, he doesn't get another get-out-of-jail-free card. If he has the same kind of performance, then they believe that Donald Trump will surely win just based on that.
Weijia Jiang at the White House for us. Thank you so much. Weijia, I want to go to Scott MacFarlane now. Scott, would you give us your sense of what this ruling means for Jack Smith's case against Donald Trump, the one that the president referred to tonight? That, of course, is the case surrounding the events related to the riots on January 6th. How does this get handled by Judge Chutkan in that case? And also, what does it mean for the timeline for that case?
If you're tracking this case with your desk calendar, throw the 2024 one out the window. Ever 2026. There are any number of people who agree with the Supreme Court ruling, a number of people who disagree, any number of people who side with Donald Trump, a number of people who side with President Biden. But everybody can come together and agree with what President Biden said near the end, that it is now highly, highly unlikely there's any trial involving Jack Smith before November 5th, 2024. The Supreme Court has pretty much knocked that possibility off the table. It was already a long shot, but pushing so much of this back to the district court judge, Tanya Chutkan, to navigate and adjudicate some of these official versus unofficial act decisions It's just not tenable to have this trial before November 5th, 2024. And you can sense from what the president said tonight, because it echoes so much of what other Democrats have said in Congress or just activists through the course of this day, that the Supreme Court has disempowered the effort to bring Donald Trump to trial and very much empowered Donald Trump if he gets back into office. This is a clear victory for Donald Trump and his defense team. And whatever becomes of this trial, it's likely to be narrower in scope, and it's likely to be prohibitively delayed.
We just heard, of course, from the president. How has the former president, Donald Trump, responded to the Supreme Court's ruling?
He has been effusive with his praise, saying it was masterfully written, that it is a victory for democracy, and that it is the culmination of what he's been advocating for. He's been advocating on his social media platform that you need immunity. Presidents must have immunity to do the job. I think he's making the argument through the course of this day and this night that the Supreme Court's ruling crystallizes what he was advocating for. You heard the president echo some of the dissent from Justice Sotomayor to today's ruling. And he says, the American people should dissent. I should dissent. Never have Supreme Court experts heard the type of language used in that dissent, that there's fear for democracy and that the court has made the president a king. You needn't be an historian or a Supreme Court expert to recognize and diagnose that's going to be something for generations to hear, for generations to come.
Scott MacFarlane, thank you so much. Scott, let's bring in election law expert David Becker. David, how do you see this ruling now here in this 12 or so hours since it's, or 10 or so hours since it's been out?
Well, if you just look at the ruling through the lens that Scott just discussed, which is an appropriate lens with regard to the current prosecutions against Donald Trump, it basically gives him immunity for some of those charges and definitely extends the time that this prosecution might take and raises the burdens for prosecutors. But I think it's important to read this ruling from the perspective as citizens of a constitutional republic in which a president is leading the executive branch. And from that perspective, it's deeply troubling. Not because it says a president is immune for official acts and not immune for unofficial acts, but because of how broadly it defines official acts. It basically says any communications and interaction with any part of the executive branch, notably the Department of Justice in this case, but could be any part of the executive branch, could be criminal, but immune from prosecution. And not only that, it says expressly that the motive and intent of the president in any of those activities interacting with members of the executive branch cannot be inquired into by the court. So you could have a situation where a president theoretically could take a bribe to cause a defendant in a federal criminal case to have that case dismissed and then call the attorney general and say, you must dismiss this case. That would be immune. He could take a bribe or have some kind of advantage in reaching out to the Department of Defense and having them take some action or refrain from some action that he might be perceived as benefiting him or benefiting an ally of his, and that would be immune from prosecution. It is a very, very broad ruling, and troublingly, not so much that it might absolve Donald Trump of his past crimes, but it could provide a roadmap for a future president who wants to act unscrupulously to do so in a way that would render him completely immune from prosecution.
David, is one of the arguments that the correct power for keep holding presidents to account for misdeeds they might do in office, like the ones you sketched and outlined there, actually is better located in the impeachment process relative to the original intent of the founders, not relative to how ineffective the impeachment process has been in practice. But is that at least one argument that can be made, notwithstanding what you just said?
Right. I think that is one of the rationalizations. And of course, we have seen the impeachment process play out where impeaching a president in the House is actually, that's a threshold that can be met. Half the House can be met in certain circumstances. But I think it's also important to recognize that it's almost impossible to conceive of any situation where a president of either party would get 67 votes in the Senate to convict and remove him. We certainly didn't see that even after Donald Trump had already left office in February of 2021, in spite of the fact that several Republican senators did vote to convict. So I think there has to be a recognition of the limits of the impeachment power. And in fact, in this opinion, even the majority admitted that there is no requirement here for a president to be convicted through impeachment first before criminal prosecution could be brought. That was one of the claims that Trump had made. And that on that count, all 9 justices agreed, at least it seemed to agree, certainly majority, that that did not apply here. So there are limits to the impeachment process overall, which means ultimately the power to prevent an unscrupulous potential president from abusing and corrupting the executive branch resides mostly with the voters in the election process to consider how these individuals might comport themselves in the presidency, now knowing for the first time in American history that most of their activity involving the executive branch will be completely immune from prosecution.
So let's linger on that for a moment. Your argument being that the voters now have to recognize that presidents who are already in what has become known as the imperial presidency, with wide-ranging powers to make war, where many people would argue they've overstepped their limits, wide-reaching agencies that are enormous, that already considerable toolkit has just gotten even more powerful, and that voters are making a conscious decision to give this new power to whomever wins re-election, or wins election, I should say, in November.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Imagine, so for instance, taking it out of the current construct, the Supreme Court said expressly that interactions with the Department of Justice enjoyed absolute immunity, regardless, and that there could be no investigation as to the president's intent in those interactions. Given that, imagine, say, President Nixon in the early 70s, instead of going outside of the executive branch, but instead of calling the FBI and saying, I want the FBI to go break into the Democratic headquarters. I want the FBI to find me information that the Democratic Party has. And if they had done it, or even if they hadn't done it, whether that was a crime or not, he would be absolutely immune. I mean, the implication here is, looking back historically, that Gerald Ford didn't need to pardon Richard Nixon for his activities during the Watergate scandal.
Do you think, David, in terms of one of the things that will have to be done is think through how the incentives will start to align here for presidents as they think about how to kind of arrange themselves to stay out of trouble? It used to be that you, as a presidency, you might try and do things outside of the official boundaries. Now, is there an incentive to do everything inside of your administration, just along the lines of what you were just saying, because you can say, well, it was an official act?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's in the majority opinion and is made somewhat defensively this point is that presidents need the power to act. They don't want to have their actions restricted. We need a president who can act without regard to concern about potential criminal liability. And I think one of the things we should think about is, isn't that something we actually desire in a president? Isn't it something that, unlike a king, a president should pause and question whether or not their activity might be a crime? In fact, isn't that why we have a White House counsel's office in the first place, to advise the president on potential boundaries of his conduct so that it's legal? And it's interesting to see here an argument made that presidents have to be above the law in order to act in the first place, because that has not been the understanding throughout this nation's history.
Dave, as a final question, how else have you been thinking about this, or do you think the fallout will reverberate from this extraordinary decision as we all kind of read through it and think about how it might affect the presidency?
Yeah, I'm thinking about it less looking backwards at the prosecutions of former President Trump right now, but looking forwards and thinking about how this decision provides a roadmap for unscrupulous individuals, if they find themselves in the Oval Office, to cloak all of their potentially criminal actions or overtly criminal actions in executive branch activity, and how that might even attract unscrupulous individuals to run for president for that purpose and that purpose alone. You could see this turn the presidency into a much more corrupt office than we have ever known. We've been very fortunate in our history that throughout the nearly 250 years of our history, the presidency has largely attracted, and even candidates of both parties have been highly principled men who put themselves above the country. And we could potentially see a shift in this. And I don't say this lightly. I think this is a very momentous decision that could have far-ranging impacts on the future of this country and how the executive branch operates.
David Becker with very sobering words there at the end. Thank you very much, David. Scott MacFarlane, if you are still with us, your final thoughts on how this will play out with the cases or just in terms of some of those incentives that we were just talking about with David?
Yeah, first of all, as always, I co-sign with what David Becker just said eloquently. On the January 6th matter, John, one of the reasons 1,400 Americans have been prosecuted for their roles in the U.S. Capitol riot, one of the reasons is to create a moral hazard, to prevent the future recurrence of something like January 6th. Getting text messages and phone calls from January 6 victims, police officers, their families, congressional staffers questioning if there's no jury trial for Donald Trump in the January 6 case, does it reduce the moral hazard? Does it make it more likely there's some variation, something like January 6th in the future, just because that pinnacle of prosecutions connected to January 6th won't happen before the election and may not happen in any real way?
And Weijia Jiang at the White House. Weijia, this was already going to be a race where Donald Trump was going to be central to the Biden campaign's argument, keeping him out of office in part because the president is unpopular and is given low marks on important issues like the border and the economy. Nevertheless, given the debate, performance, and this ruling, how much do you expect that strategy to kind of go into hyperdrive?
John, this is going to be fueling the entire strategy. And I don't think that's very different from what the plan was even before today's ruling, because they had drawn such an emphasis on January 6th. In fact, when the president declared he was going to run for re-election, they released an ad that showcased Donald Trump, that showcased what happened at the Capitol, which is precisely why I wonder who this ruling and the campaign's argument, who in terms of voters is that going to move? Because we are having very similar conversations after January 6th, and years later was the Republican primary, and it was still Donald Trump who rose to the very top. And just anecdotally, when I went out and spoke to voters, undecided voters, I should say, in the battleground state of Arizona, and I asked whether they believed democracy was on the ballot, they all told me that they thought that was a talking point that wasn't relevant to them, because as you mentioned, John, there are so many other issues that voters are considering when they decide who to vote for in November. So while the Biden team is going to go full court press on this ruling and the threats that they believe it could bring if Donald Trump were to be reelected, of course, we don't know how that will resonate with voters at the polls.
Weijia Jiang at the White House, thank you. Scott MacFarlane also, and David Becker, thank you.